So I've made a couple videos with the warp in mind, and on those I've focused on what lives in the warp. The Chaos Gods, the Chaos Space Marines, Chaos Demons, etc., etc. You get my point. And I have done a lot of thinking about what the warp is, how it functions, how it works, and how each of these entities use it. And I then thought, let me go see who has a really, really good understanding of the warp. And I only found one video on it, and it was pretty good, but it fell into the thing of talking about what lives in the warp and just describing it as a plane of infinite power and energy, and it's incomprehensible, and well, that's all good, and that is what the lore tells us. I wanted to kind of have a deeper look at it and see if I can come up with a theory of just how it actually works, how it is organized, and how it is. Because, you know, as Chaos says, it's chaos. You can't organize chaos, and, well, that's true until you start having, you know, any form of hierarchy ever, which it does. Chaos forms plans. Chaos does actions that affect in its best interests. Chaos is truly far more organized than we give it credit for. Tzeentch has councils of its Lords of Change that come to it and discuss plans. That's pretty organized, having a, you know, Zoom meeting pop up on a calendar for Tzeentch. So basically, what I want to achieve is I want to describe what the warp does. Because if I describe what the warp is, I'm just gonna have it be like me describing what the ocean is. It's a bunch of water covered in salt, and it does this. And while that is an accurate description, that does not go into currents, that does not go into the depths of the ocean, that does not describe how animals actually live in the ocean. And I want to do that the same, but for the multiplanar dimension of insanity. Also, all the sourcing on this will literally just be Warhammer 40k. It's from the experience of reading probably 60 plus novels about the universe and every mention of the warp combined in my brain. And I know, you know, that's not very reliable, but neither is the warp itself. That's my excuse. So for the layman's interpretation of the warp, it is purple hell full of demons, absolutely horrible for all time. And that would be a totally accurate and understandable statement. It's purple hell, it's full of demons, stuff that wants to eat you. It is not good for your soul, it will be eaten, and you will be murdered. The more intellectually minded individuals, Thousand Suns simps, may say, well, the warp is actually a tide of currents of emotions, and through those emotions do we understand its flows. And it really does also work like that. But the problem is the warp will work whatever way you view it. If you believe the warp is full of big purple Barney dinosaurs, the warp will be full of big purple Barney dinosaurs. The problem is, people don't think the warp is full of big purple Barney dinosaurs. They think it's full of demons. So, the warp is full of demons. It also doesn't help that your thoughts really do not affect the warp that much. Because it's not just you thinking, it's you, your neighbor's neighbor, the past 50 generations of your neighbor's family, and the star system to your right, full of a hive city of about 30 trillion people living in constant pain and slavery and suffering. Thus, the warp is altered for the worse for generations, because it is not real time with the material realm. So someone who is betrayed and feels agony and anger, much like a ghost, that will linger in the warp for a very, very, very long time. It could be hundreds of years, and those thoughts and emotions could still form into warp energy that affects the warp in a negative way. This means planets with higher emotions, higher populations, higher tragedies, more suffering, more excess of extreme emotions that the warp feeds off of should have stronger warp currents. This is not true, however, because Chaos just doesn't like a numbers game. It's not a factory thing of, you got 50 souls, good job, you made it to Chaos Demonhood, good work. Chaos does love a good story as well. Chaos loves a betrayal, a tragedy. You can get right to demon princehood if your emotions to someone is so strong that you're willing to betray them. So let's say you're a mom and you decide, you know what, I want to become a great follower of Korn. Well, you may not need to kill everyone. You may just need to kill a couple specific people, and Korn may look at that and go, good on you, blood for the blood god. I don't care where it comes from, because the warp feeds off of emotions. This is actually my theory of why it takes Chaos Space Marines killing trillions and billions of people for them to ascend to demonhood. They've already betrayed all the trust they had. They have already given themselves to the powers. So the powers are thinking, I don't need to give them anything else. They're still on the leash. So for us to join the Cool Kids Club, they better bring in some profit. Also, the warp does work under a free market. Because I think in Lords of Silence, it's kind of stated jokingly or not jokingly. It's haha, this is so true. The warp uses souls as currency. It's how you barter with demons, it's how you make deals, it's actually what Vastor asks for as well in his little thing is, you're going to become a demon engine, give me this many souls, and then you get to keep all of this cool stuff. But let's get back on topic. The warp currents that go from planet to planet are connecting similar thoughts and ideas. And this may not always be a strong connection. It can literally just be, these are two sentient things, as that is what seems to connect all the worlds, is every single world will have a sentient connection, or used to have a sentient connection on it. This means that for a lot of the galaxy and a lot of Imperial worlds, there was sentient races living on those before humans came along. And, you know, be it Eldar, but they lived on Maiden worlds, so a lot of aliens out there that used to exist. And then Big E came in, and the Necrons came through, and there's a whole thing I want to talk about in a later video about how Big E wiping out all the friendly species maybe made the galaxy a bit shittier, and that's why we have all the aliens are scary now, is because we killed all the friendly ones. So the warp will link together into hot spots of activity and low spots of activity, and the warp lanes will change based on these hot spots, usually called warp storms. That's where a warp becomes so crazy and so chaotic that nothing can travel through it. Even demons have very, very hard times getting through it. A warp storm could be just, instead of an excess of emotion going on, it could be represented in the warp as a war between two of the chaos gods, or just two concepts going to battle. So, honey, I can't go to work today, sorry. Coffee over tea is having a battle, so I can't get my car through. And by the way, that's only half satirical. Concepts pool in the warp. This is actually why chaos gods are such a big thing, is because they represent such big concepts. Khorne represents all hatred. And of course there's entities that share from that, and all entities feel a little bit of hatred. And there's kind of a debate on whether that feeds Khorne, if hating Khorne feeds Khorne, or if it becomes something. Similar with Slaanesh, if all gods feel the little bit of pleasure at their success, if they're actually feeding Khorne. I do not believe into this. I feel like that's kind of doing the thing of, you beat my ass, but you hated me, so I won. Like, no, you lost. You're on the ground losing right now. Sort of thing, where direct worship to the god in the name of that while doing their MO is helping them a lot more than, man, I really hate this Khorne guy, I should kick his ass. And then you go and kick his ass and his followers' ass, and then they're like, but you hated him. But that moves into corruption, and we're not talking about corruption today. We are purely talking about the warp. Also, getting back on topic of warp lanes and warp routes and warp storms, the warp is not in chronological order. It's very hard to explain, but a warp storm can happen before the event that makes it happen. It's very strange, but you're on a planet, your name's Joe, there's going to be a massive nuclear war on this planet. About 30 years before that war, the planet has a warp storm, and people are like, oh, what the hell? And then, because that warp storm, resources become rare, nobles start fighting, and a nuclear apocalypse happened. So the warp storm caused its own reason for existing. It's super strange how it works. Also, the warp is perception-based. The warp can seem infinite to a lot of people, and the warp can seem incredibly finite to a lot of people as well, where the warp can be as big as a studio apartment to someone, or literally an infinite blank canvas to another. This is why warp exposure is very weird, because usually it's based on your perception of the warp. Also, talking about space, the warp is finite. It is locked at the galaxy's edge. It doesn't go into the darkness of the void. And that's hard to imagine because it's infinite within itself, but it's locked inside of the confines of the galaxy. You can't take a warp. There's no warp trails outside of the galaxy. Or at least we haven't found any, and if we do, that is very, very bad. It's an infinite finite space, if that makes any sense. But as we continue, I want to start going over the deep warp, because the warp has levels, and at the surface level, it will have all the emotions, all the screaming demons, everything else. And then you have something called the deep warp, which is not really alluded to that much, but is very important, as even the Chaos Gods don't really go there. There's a couple things in the warp that the Chaos Gods do not mess with, and one of them is the Well of Eternity, which only Tzeentch messed with by throwing basically a bunch of his demons in till one popped out with two heads, and they now could see all future paths and a perfect, unbiased past. So it's very, very strange. And they never tell us what's in the deep warp. So what I think it is basically long-term storage of emotions so strong that they've sunken through. Because the Chaos Gods, when all that energy pulls up of these similar concepts, they become unbelievably sentient. And knowing the history of 40k with the War in Heaven and extreme wars, the War in Heaven lasted 50 to 60 million years. So the amount of just energy pooled there must be insane. Hell, it may just be where the old ones retreated and are hanging out if they weren't all just wiped out. Now I kind of want to talk about a theory I've made for the warp as I've looked over the evidence, how it acts, how it reacts, and the more I'm looking at it, the more it's coming across as a giant brain, if that makes any sense. It has neuron connections that form more of a whole. It has parts of it which train it to be more and more of a fuller person. It is insane. And there is talk in lore about how if the Chaos Gods were to combine into one super devil from what they already are, it would break the universe to sunder. And there's thoughts that they can't exist without each other. I do not believe that. I believe a united super chaos god of just pure chaos, this is what Chaos Undivided worships, is possible, and that as the universe of Warhammer 40k becomes worse and worse and worse, the apotheosis of this one true god is inching closer. And we also have to remember that the warp right now is not the warp that it has been for the majority of time. For the majority of the universe, the warp has been in an extreme calm state. However, because Eldar decided to get their rocks off, the warp is now so riled up, and because humans aren't exactly helping with, giving the best champions to Chaos that it could ever ask for, the warp may become a self-sustaining storm. It doesn't need the constant fuel added to the fire, eventually just being able to act as a massive galactic-sized warp storm in as itself. Because even the Eldari, who did their whole, Eldar fun time, party time, that was thousands of years ago, and that was one species that only stayed on very certain worlds and very certain conditions. And that birthed an entire new god which has been riding a high for upwards of 10,000 years. Now imagine a galaxy-sized fuck-up of that size. And if it did need to get more fuel, well, there are quite a few galaxies surrounding us that it could probably get to if the Tyranids can. Anyway, it's kind of like... You know how the Emperor eats 1,000 psychers every day, and there's a theory that maybe all that psychic energy being pooled in one spot is gonna cause his rebirth as a massive psychic entity once again, even bigger than he was before? Well, take that and apply that to the warp and all the people that worship chaos. Yeah. It's not looking that good. Anyway, that's just a kind of prediction or theory I have about it. And yeah, I may go into more depth about the warp if some idea that didn't come to my head during this whole ramble didn't come into my head. But yeah, y'all have a great one. Let me know what you think. And see you guys in the next video.